This episode of The Construction Record is brought to you by the Ontario Sewer and Water Main Construction Association. Clean water is everybody's business.
Hello, everyone. Digital media editor Warren Frey here, and today I've got our staff writer for Daily Commercial News, Don Wall, who was recently at a webinar that is significant to Black History Month. And without any further ado, because Don's the expert here, I'll let him take it away.
Hi, Warren. Yeah, today I'll be presenting audio clips and talking about a webinar I watched on February 1st, so the first day of Black History Month, put on by ULI Toronto, that's the Urban Land Institute. They hosted a presentation called Redressing Black Displacement in Canada. So the moderator was Camille Mitchell, an architect. The discussion featured people from across the country, Angela Simmonds, Manager of Equity and Access with the Nova Scotia Barristers Society, Itah Sadu, co-owner of Toronto's A Different Booklist Cultural Centre, and Stephanie Allen, she's a founding member of the Hogan Society in Vancouver. Mm-hmm. So I found the speakers very powerful and passionate. You know, sometimes you listen to webinars dispassionately as a professional, but these made some really strong statements talking about injustice and disenfranchisement. So, that's perfectly suitable for presentation. As the audio clips will show. Mm-hmm. Okay, so they came at their stories from different moments in history. So Simmonds is an advocate with the Nova Scotia Land Titles Initiative, which is a commitment to help residents in 5 historically Black communities get clear title to their land. When Blacks came to Nova Scotia circa the 1700s, they were not given title to the lands they live on, merely a right to occupy, unlike whites who arrived at the same time. So the legacy of that barrier is that Blacks are often renters, and there is still a racial divide. So Simmonds is from North Preston. So Itah Sadu, she's a representative of the Black business community in the Bathurst and Bloor neighborhood of Toronto, long-standing Black business community going back many generations. As I say, she was the owner of Toronto's A Different Booklist Cultural Centre, but back in 2013, when it was announced that Honest Ed's would be redeveloped, she was just a bookstore owner, but it was an informal community center, and everybody came, and it's changed the news of the day. So now it's a formal cultural center after negotiations with the developer. So out in Vancouver, Stephanie Allen, she worked in the private sector as a real estate developer and is now an executive with BC Housing. So the Hogan's Alley Society advocates for Black Vancouverites who have been the victims of urban renewal. 50 years ago, construction of the Georgian Dunsmuir viaducts displaced an immigrant enclave. The society today is active in working to acquire land and develop assets as a community land trust.
And so you've got a bunch of clips here, and so you're going to sort of introduce each clip as we go with it, and that sort of kind of walks us through the webinar in effect.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Don.
Yeah. So Camille Mitchell, let's let her. Got a clip here. She talks about her approach to the session. She kept it rolling really well.
I think what excited me about this panel discussion is the opportunity to look at Canadian history again. I believe as a Canadian, we've romanticized our Black history in this country, and we've often pivoted ourselves against our American neighbors to the south as better than. So this is opportunity, which I think is important for this real estate and development community, is to take notes, not just listen, but take notes on what they can do within their own circles to affect change, and also be mindful of the stories we've learned and opportunity to unlearn, and be mindful of whose stories we've been telling to ourselves.
And you have another clip with Itah Sadu.
Yeah, so in this clip, Itah Sadu talks about summoning up the determination to fight for an inclusive future after learning that Honest Ed's would be redeveloped.
But back to the cultural center. So there was we came to a moment almost in our 20th year of existence where the Mirvish village was closing, no more. And suddenly we were told that a new developer was coming and things were changing. As people of African descent, change is always part of our DNA. And so we had to think, how are we going to embrace this change? Again, as people who have been in community trenches, attending so many meetings around the city, looking at other spaces approaching redevelopment or gentrification, the question to us was, how do we enter this space of redevelopment? And so the first thing that we looked at was the name of the developer. And that name excited us. It was Gillespie. And so that made us that reminded us of Dizzy Gillespie. And so we approached this development into the movement of dance. We were going to come into this development, not to be scared to talk to a developer or about development, but we were going to be bold because we came with history. We came from places where we have done great things. So this was a new and exciting conversation for us to enter in, knowing that on Bathurst Street at the Bathurst and Bloor intersection, we just not only lived in that community, but we also had a very vibrant and practicing and active business community. And so today we are now in the process of developing a permanent home so that we can plant roots permanently into this land.
Next, Angela Simmonds here discusses how oppressed communities tend to stay marginalized. She mentioned the displacement of Blacks in Africville, which was a notorious episode most Canadians know about, in Nova Scotia history in the 1960s. They were moved out of that community, but became perpetual renters. So talking about North Preston, where she lives, she mentions how it takes an hour to get from North Preston to downtown Halifax by bus. So there's a cycle of poverty and disenfranchisement.
I think the legislation and which guides us is great, but it's the people actually behind the scenes who keep enforcing and kind of interpreting these policies and legislation in the wrong way, which continues to marginalize and oppress certain communities, in particular Afro-Nova Scotian communities. And to your point about Africville, government thinks that it did a wonderful thing by giving, parts of Uniacke Square, which we know is Uniacke Square. And when you take a group of people and then center them in a different location, and then they have to continuously rent and never own, is actually very different than owning a house and community property in Africville. There's no ownership of anyone who has been displaced from Africville. And so similarly with the community of North Preston, and I would speak, there's 13 other areas, but again, my passion lies in North Preston just because of my own historical roots, and because I do believe it is still such an oppressed community. The bus route between going to North Preston to even get to the city is over an hour. So those just talk about the resources that just aren't even available of no sidewalks because this community is so displaced. One way in, one way out is a huge and still continues to be problematic for our youth and for even the growth of any kind of ownership. And to what Stephanie had mentioned earlier in terms of this community land trust, I think it's a real opportunity for us, for Black folks, to kind of own something and then be able to leave it generationally and be able to still be successful by the same way that flourishing white communities are.
Stephanie Allen, she's been in real estate for 20 years. And she says, I can speak with authority that this is an industry rooted in white supremacy. She says capitalist institutions and practices prevented displaced Blacks from gaining a proper foothold. And so a land trust is their preferred solution.
My background is as a real estate developer. I've worked in the for-profit sector, the nonprofit sector, and now in government. My career spans about 19 years in Western North America. And as someone who has worked so long in that industry, I can speak with authority by saying that this is an industry that is definitely rooted in and founded upon white supremacy. And the work that I'm talking about when I talk about white supremacy is not the violent kind that we saw storm the Capitol, but the systemic kind, the kind that has ordered people and put certain power structures in place that favor some and disadvantage others. And that is the story of Hogan's Alley. Hogan's Alley was a Black community that formed in the late 1800s, early 1900s at the area of Vancouver where most racialized people were allowed to live. I say allowed to live because there were absolutely systemic barriers in land use policy, deeply rooted in land use policy that we borrowed from the United States to set up our cities that put wealthy white landowners on large properties in certain areas and lower income racialized people in smaller tracts of housing located to the less desirable areas of town. Now, this community flourished for a time. And Black folks who lived here had a bustling little community. There was a church that had 800 members at its peak. There was Vi's Chicken and Steaks, where you would find the top names of Black entertainment that would come through this city at the after hours spot. You see Ella Fitzgerald and Sammy Davis Jr. I mean, this is a place of really wondrous accomplishments and people and community. And unfortunately, because of that existence, because of their Blackness, they were targeted for displacement. Sometimes when we think about displacement, displacement doesn't always have a planned place for you to go. It just wants you out. And that was the case with Hogan's Alley. This was a Black community that was targeted through land use policy for eviction. Now, some of us in the Black community, many years later, the city of Vancouver have targeted this area for big redevelopment. We put up our hands and said, this should be a community land trust that should hold these assets in community hands, and that the city of Vancouver should not profit from these lands. So looking forward to talking a little bit more about how we talk about land trust, community-owned assets as a way of disrupting the white supremacy that has continued to marginalize our people and keep us impoverished.
Okay, now here's Stephanie again. She explains how Blacks with families coming from slavery many generations ago tend to live in a property ownership system that always excludes them. She also refers to how Indigenous Canadians were displaced. So they know, as a point she makes here, property rights that you have can be taken away.
When I went to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and I saw that what slavery was, it was a rights-based property ownership system. We have inherited and continue to live in a rights-based property ownership system that has always excluded us. We were the mortgageable interest in the founding of these lands, when land had no conceived value, when they were just exterminating Indigenous people off their lands. The land wasn't mortgageable, our lives were. So when we think about what we're trying to transform and why a community land trust is something we're interested in, is because we know that even if we get enough Black folks owning homes, which I think we should, it still doesn't have access in a system of capitalism, because there's still going to be poor people in a capitalist society. That's just a reality. It's an output of the inputs. So if people are going to continue to have that disadvantage through poverty, my question is, why do we want to continue to see, property rights be the foundation we stand on, when property rights can be taken away from us, which has happened in Hogan's Alley, which has happened in other areas, because they can use other mechanisms. So I agree that developers that are putting projects together need to work in community and look at how those assets are being kept in perpetuity. But I think it's really policymakers that have got to hold these frameworks in place to make sure that communities have those benefits. Otherwise, they will not benefit.
Okay, now Itah Sadu jumps right in and talks about the underestimation of her talents she felt when she was in a room talking about land trusts.
I think even one of the first things that I find problematic, and I remember when the notion of land trust came upon us with the Cultural Center as an option, would you explore this notion called land trust? And I remember the first thought that I had in the room was how freely people could talk about land trusts that were non-Black or not racialized people. And this land trust thing seemed to be a secret that was being discussed in other areas, but it was not part of our everyday conversation in the community. My mother always says that Canadians have a polite racism. I will send you a plate of food, but please do not move next door to me. And then when we entered into the conversation of the land trust, there was always the notion that we wouldn't understand the complexity of this huge thing. So from the get-go, you're faced with a barrier. And that barrier, and it was important for me to start today to tell you my background in Barbados, because when we enter into a space immediately, you're confronted with the barriers. You're not part of this world. You don't really know. You don't have the expertise. Where are your resources? All these things. So even to get going in the conversation, it is almost, you have to drag that chair to the table, bring all the other lawn chairs with you at the same time to show people that you have the capacity, the intelligence, and the intellect to even enter into the conversation.
Okay, in this next clip, Stephanie Allen makes the case that decisions have to be made not just with Black people at the table, but rather by Black people themselves.
What I think, our experience has been is that we actually need the resources and the power to determine our own solutions. It can no longer just be a seat at someone else's table where the entire thing was built before we got there. I think what you see when you talk about community land trust, and just to make a note, community land trust started in North America by Black people in Georgia. It was a civil rights movement to recognize that Black farmers and Black people were being pushed off their lands through terrorism, right? Through the Ku Klux Klan and lynching. So when we go to the roots of land trust, it's recognizing that we come from our ancestry, which is communalism. We believe in interdependence. We believe in having those social networks that we survive on. And as displaced peoples that have now descended many hundreds of years in these lands, we recognize that we need a place to call home. We need a place to shelter from some of the ways that we continue to be excluded. Now, absolutely, I want listeners to think about how their organizations are decolonizing, how their organizations are working to support community. But I think we've got to get our heads around the fact that we want to determine the solutions ourselves. We want Black organizations in this country to be founded and run by ourselves with our lenses, with our approaches to working in community, with our, principles and values that support our own needs, because we know what they are best. And so when we look at the community, we're asking the city of Vancouver for an entire city block in the most extensive city in the world. We know the value of the lands that they kicked us off of, decades ago. But we want to create something that's not for profit, but that's social enterprise driven, that gives all the entrepreneurial experiences, that gives affordable, great homes for people that they can live in generationally. But we recognize that that's a barrier to an institution like the City of Vancouver, which is deeply colonial. So we're fighting something that people can't get their heads around because they think if they could hire some Black folks into their organizations, that's enough. It's not enough. Let us build our organizations, seed our organizations to grow, and give us the resources to determine our own solutions. I think that's the kind of thing we need all these organizations to think about in a much deeper way.
And so besides the webinar itself, you also contacted Itah Sadu and did an extra interview to talk to her to sort of further flesh out these themes, right?
Yeah. I wanted to talk to her specifically about how citizens can group together and some of the challenges they face. So, in her case, she finally came face to face with a developer. She had good relationship with the development team. Finally, the developer, Ian Gillespie, who's from Vancouver, came to Toronto and she met up with him, had a positive meeting. And she also talks about her hopes for the future for her and the Black community in the area.
There's such an urgency in our community, in our community for meeting space, for just a space to call home, just a space to show who you are. That people thought that this was an opportunity that was good to go. They saw the history value of it. They saw that we had demonstrated against all kind of odds, and we had landed at 20 and now 25, So that is the kind of energy. They saw it as a good news story. They saw it as something that they dared to dream. They saw it as, oh my God, these people are taking a huge risk. They saw it as, oh, how's this going to work? They saw it as all of that. But here's the thing. A community that is not Black that lives in the Bathurst-Bloor Annex neighborhood, they also too were big allies and supporters. I would go to meetings and they would speak about us as an institution, and I wouldn't even have to say a word. I think my husband, I, our volunteers, our board members, we attended every single frickin' meeting that development, that process, that community consultation had. We found people that were on our database who lived in that neighborhood, and if we couldn't attend them, they went to those meetings. Right? So that was the kind of energy that we entered it with. Right? We entered it with. And again, always looking, what is it that we fear? Right? What is it that we've learned in all of these exercises? So then the first thing that happened then is that I think ERA, as I talked about, that came into our lives. Right? Was it the officer? Was it the leadership of ERA? You know, people say, oh, it's a high-end firm, whatever. But our experience with them has been one to say, how can we help? How can we assist? This is what we do. This is the particular expertise. They did that before George Floyd. That's good to say. You don't have to beat them up. You know, maybe they'll send you $1 million bill. I don't know. I don't think so. Yeah. But what I saw was how interested they were in order for us to succeed. I think because we also, too, as a bookstore, come out of intellectual capacity and legacy and whatever, I think that impacts the society.
Can you talk about who are these these advocates? Talk about what was it who were they?
People, whether it's the BIA, Mervish BIA people, whether it be the Laneway Committee and the Annex Committee, these are residents, these are neighbors, these are the folks who live on the streets and the side streets and come to the space and all of that. They were just, advocate. People we didn't know, but you probably see them come in, because people read, and there's a book that's attached to everything. So there are all these constituencies of people. Mm-hmm. And there's an eclectic neighborhood, and we're landed in a place where, they used to be Lightman's and Book City and, the women's bookstore. So we are also, too, in that sort of book capital or mecca in the city.
Yep. So
come out of that tradition. Right?
Sounds like a strength in numbers, lots of ideas percolating, and you had a receptive development team that wanted to do things right. Is that the way it developed?
I think maybe as new people coming into town, because West Bank is a Vancouver-based company, maybe you wanted to do things different. Maybe that's part of that corporate culture.
Okay, so clarify what you're saying about were there generally good a relationship with a developer and good solutions proposed that were inclusive and respectful of your community and of you?
Oh, I think so. I think so. When we finally met Ian Gillespie, it was a day where we didn't plan. He just showed up. We were told he was coming at this time, and he had promised all the time that he would come, and finally he came. But over the time, you wrote to him, he wrote back, and you didn't feel like though it was somebody writing the letter. You thought it was his voice. So finally he comes, and it is like a day you dream. A day you dream. There are people who are meeting. It's a Black conference. It's a national conference. It's being facilitated. So technology is in use, and all of that. The place is buzzing. People are coming in. They're buying books. You can see the staff. You can see all of that. And then we wanted to. Then through the door came Panman Pat, the panist, and then we introduced him to the steel pan, and he got all excited about that. And we had a frank, free conversation with him as he saw us. He saw the history. He saw the engagement of people with the history. So we didn't have to stage this day. I was so happy about that, that he could see us demonstrate. He just rolled in. And he was so, I think, maybe taken with the place and spoke so freely that he left his bag. And I think about 7 o'clock in the evening, someone phoned to find out if it was there. And it was in the same spot that he left it all day, and nobody even paid attention to that.
Okay, so a positive experience and pretty good discussion, good dialogue, reaching some understandings. Could you talk about some of the solutions that came about that came from this joint effort, you and your allies in the community? What did you achieve to preserve the sense of community that you feared you'd lose?
The opportunity to have a permanent home. the opportunity to have a place where your roots can be greater. That's a huge solution. That's a huge piece. To see it. Not to think that it ought to exist, but to see that what you are currently doing can be just bigger and be permanent. To see that as a community, this allows so many of us with common interests to work together. To see that this is a story that we can document in Canadian history. To see that this is a model that we can work on and create for others to emulate or to build on.
Yeah.
What are the solutions? The solutions are every time that you're in the room, that you speak as freely as possible, and you want to ensure that you're heard. So when we said we wanted to do Black First or that exhibition, they said, wonderful, let's start in Africa. And we said, no, we start at Bathurst and Bloor. Right?
Yeah.
And as we've been down the road starting in Africa, we be still stuck there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're here now. So even little things like that, change in language, framework, or context, allowing us to bring in our expertise on this side of the table into the conversation, right? Ongoing meetings, that type of thing.
And those meetings are going on, so so you've got a new place for your new cultural center. What does the rest of the community? Are their interests? How well have they been protected? Do you think? Will there be the will there be some of the institutions and the sense of community that existed before, or will that be preserved?
I think what we will see is in the project, we will see the children of those people. We will see some of those people who may come back in the experience of the food sector. But what we are going to see now are the children of those people as entrepreneurs, with their emphasis on design, with their emphasis on Afrocentric marketplaces, with their emphasis on whatever, youth culture. That's what we're going to see. We're going to see this new generation come. We're going to see maybe a space where musicians and artistic people in the community. I think those are the kind of things that we're going to see. I don't think it is like when people ask me, when you grew up, did you sit around the campfire and listen to stories? And I say to them, no, my grandmother told stories every day. That's the fluidity of the piece. Yeah. Memory will be preserved. In the build-in, I think across the development, when they have asked, how do we celebrate what came before? They have asked. And they have also said, and then it is also up to us to say to people, get into the affordable housing. That's all part of it, So it is not just about building the center. It is about us. It's also to think in it, how do we also move our community forward as we move at the same time? Because they have said to us, you are a cultural center. You are a meeting point. So we are supporting what we have seen as an evolution. And our response to them must be, hey, come, here's another opportunity that you can probably participate in.
So I guess, Don, what would your overall impression of the webinar and the interview be, and sort of the current situation?
It's online. I recommend everybody, locate it, and it's a very, a series of powerful statements, people well chosen, and it represents, a diversity of injustices across the country. So, good way to kick off the month. And, there are lots of, at one point in the podcast, it says, I hope developers are taking notes on this. I think Camille says that at the beginning. So let's hope they are.
Great. And we'll include the link to the webinar in the show notes so everybody can watch it. Okay. Thanks, Don.
Okay. Thanks, Warren.
And make sure to tune in to next Friday's podcast, where we're going to have National Managing Editor Vince Versace hosting a panel discussion with Black construction leaders discussing the current state of the industry. Thanks.
This episode of The Construction Record is brought to you by the Greater Toronto Sewer and Water Main Contractors Association. Clean water, our goal, our future.